Less than 2 decades ago, the remote island was facing an environmental catastrophe caused by an explosion. Rats.
Even if one mouse were to survive, the island was doomed. No one knew if it would work.
It's the latest challenge pushing farmers to breaking point. Millions of mice running riot and destroying valuable stock feed.
In 2016, New Zealand launched a high-stakes mission unlike anything ever attempted, dropping 65 tons of poison across a remote, storm-battered island in the sub-Antarctic.
There are concerns that native fish species could be killed with secondary poisoning, the New South Wales mouse plague.
All to wipe out invaders no bigger than your thumb. The goal? Eradicate every last mouse on the Antipodes Islands before they could finish off some of the rarest birds and insects on Earth. They had one shot, one winter, one chance to save a collapsing island.
It's just, horrible. About 2 million mice, in my estimate, is what I've seen in my place.
2 million mice.
Yeah.
When scientists returned a year later, what they discovered was far more shocking than anyone imagined. The arrival of tiny killers. They hunted in packs, scaling cliffs under cover of darkness. Some attacked birds 300 times their size, devouring helpless chicks alive in their nests. And they were no bigger than your thumb. By the time scientists realized what was happening, the Antipodes Islands were already under siege. What should have been a sanctuary for some of the world's rarest wildlife had become a silent battlefield. The invaders? House mice, ordinary in appearance but devastating in impact. It all started back in 1893, when uninvited guests arrived on the island's remote shores. The mice likely came aboard a shipwreck, possibly the French bark President Felix Faure, which smashed against the cliffs in 1903, or perhaps even earlier from seal hunters' vessels. However they got there, one thing was certain. These tiny stowaways had found a paradise with no natural predators and an endless food supply. They multiplied fast, and they thrived. With no competition and a limitless food supply, the mouse population exploded, reaching 200,000 across just 5,000 windswept acres.
It's just, horrible. About 2 million mice, in my estimate, is what I've seen in my place.
2 million mice.
Yeah.
That's 40 mice per acre, tearing through the island's insects, birds, and food web like a plague with claws. But it wasn't just their numbers that shocked scientists. It was their behavior. These mice weren't just eating plants and seeds. They were climbing sheer rock faces to raid nests, coordinating attacks on live birds, and wiping out insect species that had evolved in isolation over millions of years. Some of the island's native species had survived unchanged for millions of years. Now they were being wiped out in a matter of seasons. The Antipodean parakeet, the island pipit, the snipe, entire insect populations vanished, and the worst was yet to come. Researchers feared the same fate as Gough Island, where mice were caught on film swarming and killing seabirds in coordinated attacks. With 21 species of breeding seabirds on the Antipodes, including the critically endangered wandering albatross, scientists knew they were running out of time. What came next would be one of the boldest, most dangerous eradication missions ever attempted. And if they failed, if even one mouse survived, it would all be for nothing. The $1 million gamble. By 2014, faced with a ticking ecological time bomb, New Zealand's Department of Conservation faced an impossible choice. The Antipodes Islands were dying slowly, their unique ecosystem crumbling under the weight of 200,000 mice. Every day of delay meant more extinct species, more collapsed food webs, and less chance of recovery. The solution seemed simple: kill all the mice. But in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth, simple became impossibly complex. The project, dubbed $1 Million Mouse, would cost $680,000 and require a level of precision that had never been attempted in conservation history. The challenge was absolute: kill every single mouse, or the mission would fail. Miss even one pregnant female, and within months, the population would begin recovering. Within a few years, they'd be back to 200,000 individuals, and the entire operation would have been pointless. Project leader Stephen Horn from the Department of Conservation knew they were attempting something unprecedented. The island's isolation made it nearly impossible to reach, let alone work on. There were no harbors, no safe landing spots, and weather windows lasted only hours. The coastline consisted entirely of towering cliffs battered by sub-Antarctic storms.
The remote Antipodes Islands are 760 kilometres southeast of New Zealand.
It's an island that's fairly remote and there's no safe harbours for boats.
For 2 years, teams prepared for the assault. They built temporary shelters, cleared helicopter landing pads, and established fuel depots. Every piece of equipment had to be transported by helicopter in tiny loads, fighting against winds that could ground aircraft for weeks. The eradication method was as simple as it was controversial: aerial poison drops. They would carpet the entire island with grain-based rodent bait laced with brodifacoum, a powerful anticoagulant that would cause the mice to bleed to death internally. The bait was specially designed to be attractive to mice while minimizing harm to birds and other wildlife.
This is the second stage of the poison drop. It's a massive poison drop.
But the logistics were staggering. 65 tons of poison had to be distributed evenly across 5,000 acres of impossible terrain. 2 helicopters would need to make hundreds of flights, navigating through fog, rain, and winds that could flip aircraft like toys. The pilots would have to fly precise grid patterns, ensuring every square meter received exactly the right amount of bait. The margin for error was 0. Too little poison, and some mice would survive. Too much, and they'd risk killing the very wildlife they were trying to save. Weather delays could leave gaps in coverage, creating safe zones where mice could hide and breed.
Mice are prolific breeders.
Ground teams of 13 people would support the operation, spending 75 days in conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. They'd monitor bait stations, search for survivors, and collect data on the operation's effectiveness. Living in basic huts with no communication to the outside world, they'd face isolation that few humans ever experience. The risks extended beyond the mission itself. One equipment failure, one serious injury, one unexpected storm, and the entire team could be stranded on an island with no rescue possible for weeks or months. As winter approached in 2016, everything was ready. But what happened next would test the limits of human determination and reveal whether humanity could actually reverse the damage it had caused.
They are basically naturally suspicious of anything new in their environment.
The siege begins. June 2016 brought the harsh Antarctic winter to the Antipodes Islands. But for the $1 Million Mouse team, it was the perfect hunting season. Winter meant the mice were desperate for food, making them more likely to take the poison bait. It also meant fewer birds were nesting, reducing the risk of accidental casualties. The operation began with military precision. 2 helicopters lifted off from the temporary base, their cargo holds filled with specially formulated poison pellets. Each pilot had to fly predetermined grid patterns, maintaining exact speeds and altitudes while fighting winds that could reach 100 kilometers per hour. The first challenge came immediately: the weather. Antarctic storms rolled in with little warning, creating whiteout conditions that made flying impossible. The helicopters would race against time, dropping bait whenever brief windows of clear weather appeared. Sometimes they had only minutes between storms. Flying over the island's treacherous terrain required nerves of steel. The helicopters had to navigate between towering cliffs and hidden valleys, maintaining precise altitude to ensure even distribution of the poison. Too high, and the bait would scatter uselessly. Too low, and the aircraft risked crashing into the rocky landscape. The poison itself was a marvel of engineering. Each pellet contained enough brodifacoum to kill a mouse, but the formula was designed to break down quickly in the environment.
This is the pre-feed. It's just non-toxic. We don't have a bait which targets stoats directly.
The pellets were dyed green to make them visible against the dark soil, allowing ground teams to monitor coverage. On the ground, the 13-person team lived in Spartan conditions that tested their endurance. They slept in basic huts with no heating, ate military rations, and worked in temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. Their job was to monitor bait stations, document the operation's progress, and search for any signs of mouse survival. The first drops went smoothly, but then the weather turned violent. A massive storm system swept across the island, grounding the helicopters for days. The team watched helplessly as their carefully planned schedule fell apart. Every day of delay increased the risk that mice would learn to avoid the bait or that gaps in coverage would create safe zones. When the weather finally cleared, the pilots pushed their aircraft to the limit. They flew dangerous missions in marginal conditions, racing to complete the coverage before the next storm hit. The ground team reported that mice were taking the bait enthusiastically, but they couldn't be sure if they were reaching every individual. The second phase of drops began on June 29th, designed to catch any mice that had missed the first round. Again, weather became the enemy. Fog rolled in without warning, forcing pilots to navigate by instruments alone. The helicopters disappeared into gray clouds, emerging minutes later to continue their deadly cargo drops. By July 13th, all 65 tons of poison had been distributed across the island. The helicopters fell silent, and an eerie calm settled over the Antipodes. The ground team began their most crucial work, searching for survivors in a landscape that had become a graveyard for 200,000 mice. But the real test was just beginning, and what they found would determine whether they had achieved the impossible or created a disaster. The waiting game. In the days following the final bait drop,
it was a really creative process in a way. Spent a lot of time working long hours.
The Antipodes Islands fell into an unnatural silence. The ground team of 13 people began the most nerve-wracking phase of their mission, searching for proof that every single mouse had been eradicated. They spent entire days turning over rocks, checking crevices, and examining every possible hiding spot across 5,000 acres of brutal terrain. The poison didn't kill instantly. It could take up to 2 weeks for Brodifacoum to fully eliminate the mouse population. During this time, the team found thousands of mouse carcasses scattered across the island, but they needed to find them all. The search revealed the true scale of the infestation. Mouse bodies were everywhere, tucked under rocks, hidden in tussock grass, and even in the most unlikely places like cliff faces and shoreline crevices. The sheer number was staggering. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of the massive population that had been devouring the island's ecosystem. But finding dead mice wasn't enough. The team needed to prove there were no survivors, and that was nearly impossible. A single mouse could hide in thousands of potential shelter spots. The island's complex topography, with its deep valleys, rocky outcrops, and dense vegetation, provided endless hiding places for any survivors. The psychological pressure was immense. Every member of the team knew that missing just one mouse would doom the entire operation. They worked methodically, section by section, but the nagging doubt persisted. What if they missed something? What if one pregnant female was hiding somewhere, ready to restart the population? Weather continued to be their enemy. Strong winds made detailed searching difficult, and frequent storms forced the team to take shelter for days at a time. Each delay increased their anxiety and reduced their remaining time on the island. The team used every detection method available. They set up monitoring stations with fresh bait to see if any mice would take it. They looked for fresh droppings, gnaw marks on vegetation, and any signs of mouse activity. They even brought tracking cards covered in substances that would show mouse footprints. As the days passed, the signs became increasingly positive. No fresh mouse sign appeared anywhere on the island. The monitoring stations remained untouched. The tracking cards showed no evidence of mouse activity. But the team couldn't be certain. Mice are notoriously good at avoiding detection. By August 6, 2016, the team had spent 75 days on the island and found no evidence of surviving mice. They packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, but their work was far from over. The real test would come later, when monitoring teams would return to search for any signs of population recovery. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying the exhausted team back to civilization, they left behind an island that appeared to be mouse-free for the first time in over a century. But appearances could be deceiving, and the next phase of the operation would determine whether they had achieved conservation history or created an expensive failure. The moment of truth. For 18 months after the eradication operation, the Antipodes Islands remained empty of human observers. The Department of Conservation had deliberately chosen to wait before conducting follow-up surveys. They needed to give any potential survivors enough time to reveal themselves through population growth. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. If even a single mouse had survived, the population would have begun recovering by early 2017. By late 2017, there would be clear signs of mouse activity if the operation had failed. But if the eradication had succeeded, there'd be nothing. No tracks, no droppings, not even a single squeak. And that silence would be the sweetest sound of success. In March 2018, nearly 2 years after the poison drops, the moment of truth arrived. A monitoring team led by Finley Cox from the Department of Conservation returned to the Antipodes Islands. This time, they brought 3 highly trained rodent detection dogs and their handlers, the ultimate test of whether any mice remained. The dogs were specially trained to detect the scent of live mice in their droppings. Their noses were so sensitive they could smell a single mouse from hundreds of miles away. If any mice had survived the eradication, the dogs would find them. The team spent nearly a month systematically searching the island. They covered every habitat type, from coastal areas to the highest peaks. The dogs investigated thousands of potential hiding spots, their handlers watching nervously for any sign of excitement that would indicate a mouse detection. Day after day, the dogs found nothing. No mouse scent, no droppings, no evidence of any rodent activity. The monitoring stations remained untouched. The tracking cards showed no footprints. There wasn't a single squeak from the island that had once been home to 200,000 mice. But the team found something else, something that made their hearts race with excitement. The island's ecosystem was already beginning to recover. Native insects that had been driven to near extinction were reappearing. Plant communities that had been damaged by mouse browsing were showing signs of recovery. Most dramatically, the endemic bird species were thriving. The Antipodean parakeet, the Antipodes Island pipit, and the Antipodes Island snipe were all showing increased numbers and expanded ranges. Without mice competing for food and destroying their habitat, these unique birds were reclaiming their island. The monitoring revealed that the ecosystem recovery was happening faster than anyone had predicted. The removal of 200,000 mice had created a cascade effect throughout the food web. Insects were multiplying rapidly without mouse predation. Plants were growing more vigorously without constant browsing pressure. The birds were benefiting from both increased food availability and reduced competition. On March 20, 2018, New Zealand's Minister of Conservation made the official announcement.
The mouse hunt on one of New Zealand's most remote islands is finally complete.
The Antipodes Islands had been declared mouse-free.
Scientists and dock staff are spending the next 3 weeks trying to find out if the world's biggest mouse hunt has been a success.
The $1 Million Mouse Project was officially declared a complete success. The celebration was worldwide. Conservation organizations hailed it as one of the most successful island restoration projects ever completed. The technical achievement was remarkable. Successfully eradicating every single mouse from such a remote and challenging environment had never been done before. But the real shock was still to come. What scientists discovered in the years following the eradication would exceed their wildest expectations and prove that sometimes nature's capacity for recovery can surprise even the experts. Nature's incredible comeback. The years following the mouse eradication revealed an ecological transformation that stunned scientists worldwide. The Antipodes Islands didn't just recover, they exploded back to life in ways that exceeded every prediction. By 2020, 4 years after the eradication, the island's insect populations had increased by over 300%. Species that had been reduced to tiny remnant populations were now thriving across their entire historical ranges. The ecosystem's foundation was rebuilding itself at an unprecedented rate. The recovery wasn't just about numbers, it was about diversity. Insects that scientists thought might be extinct were rediscovered, emerging from hidden refuges where they had survived the mouse invasion. The island's 150 insect species, 17% of which are found nowhere else on Earth, were reclaiming their ecological niches. The birds' recovery was even more dramatic. The Antipodean parakeet, which had been restricted to small clifftop refuges, began expanding back into lowland areas where mice had previously dominated. Their numbers increased by 400% in just 4 years, and they were nesting in areas that had been off-limits for over a century. The Antipodes Island pipit, the world's southernmost songbird, showed the most remarkable recovery. Their population doubled within 2 years and continued growing. Without mice competing for their insect prey, the pipits were raising larger broods and expanding into new territories. Most surprising was the vegetation recovery. Scientists discovered that mice had been suppressing plant growth far more than anyone realized. Without constant browsing pressure, native plants began growing taller and more vigorously. Rare plant species that had been confined to mouse-free cliff faces began spreading back into areas where they hadn't been seen for decades. The recovery created a positive feedback loop. More plants supported more insects, which supported more birds, which dispersed more seeds, which created more plants. The ecosystem was regenerating itself through natural processes that had been disrupted for over a century. Seabird populations also began recovering. The 21 species of breeding seabirds on the island, including the critically endangered Antipodean wandering albatross, showed increased breeding success. Without mice threatening their chicks or competing for food, these magnificent birds were raising more offspring and expanding their nesting areas. The soil itself was healing. Mouse burrows that had riddled the island's surface were collapsing and being reclaimed by vegetation. The constant disturbance that had characterized the ecosystem for over a century had ended, allowing natural processes to resume. Scientists conducting long-term monitoring were amazed by the speed and completeness of the recovery. Dr. Keith Springer, who led the monitoring efforts, described it as watching an ecosystem resurrect itself. The island was returning to a state that no living human had ever seen. The success created a ripple effect throughout the conservation world. The techniques developed for the Antipodes project were being adapted for use on other islands. The $1 Million Mouse Project had proven that even the most degraded ecosystems could be restored if invasive species were completely eliminated. Yet the most jaw-dropping revelation was still ahead, one that didn't just reinforce the mission's success, but shattered long-held beliefs about how invasive species trigger ecological collapse. The hidden truth revealed. The eradication was a triumph, but what it uncovered left scientists stunned, because once the mice were gone, the island started speaking, and what it revealed was far worse than anyone had imagined. As scientists continued studying the recovered ecosystem, they uncovered a disturbing truth that had been hidden for over a century. The mice hadn't just been eating insects and competing with birds, they had been systematically restructuring the entire island's ecology in ways that nobody had fully understood. Advanced DNA analysis of soil samples revealed that the mice had driven to extinction not just the 3 insect species scientists knew about, but potentially dozens more. The island's biodiversity loss had been far worse than anyone realized. Some species had disappeared so completely that they left no trace except genetic fragments in the soil. But that was just the beginning. The mice had also been acting as ecosystem engineers, fundamentally altering the island's physical structure. Their burrows had riddled the landscape, creating erosion patterns that changed water flow and soil composition. Areas that scientists thought were naturally barren had actually been degraded by mouse activity over multiple generations. Even more disturbing was what they had done to the island's fire cycle. By eating seeds and seedlings, they had prevented the natural regeneration of vegetation that would normally fuel small fires. This had led to an unnatural buildup of dead plant material, creating a time bomb of dry fuel that could have sparked a catastrophic blaze, wiping out what little life remained. The research revealed that the 200,000 mice had been consuming an estimated 100 tons of plant and animal matter annually. This massive extraction of biomass had been bleeding the ecosystem dry, creating a downward spiral that would have eventually led to total collapse. Scientists also discovered that the mice had been affecting the island's climate. Their destruction of vegetation had reduced the island's ability to retain moisture, creating drier conditions that further stressed the ecosystem. The mouse-free island was showing increased humidity and more stable weather patterns. And then came the most unexpected discovery of all. The mice had changed. The genetic analysis revealed another startling fact. The mice population had been growing increasingly aggressive over time. Genetic markers showed that the island mice had evolved to be more predatory than their mainland cousins, developing larger teeth and stronger jaw muscles. They were becoming increasingly efficient killers, adapted specifically to the island environment. The recovery monitoring showed that ecosystem functions were returning that scientists hadn't even known were missing. Pollination networks were rebuilding as native insects returned. Seed dispersal patterns were normalizing as birds reclaimed their territories. The island's food web was becoming more complex and resilient. And here's the final sobering truth. The research revealed that the Antipodes had been on the verge of complete ecosystem collapse. Computer models suggested that within another decade, the mouse population would have reached a tipping point where the ecosystem would have been permanently damaged. The timing of the eradication had been crucial. Waiting any longer might have meant the recovery would be impossible. The findings transformed scientific understanding of invasive species impacts. The mice hadn't just been pests. They had been ecosystem destroyers operating on a scale that few had imagined. Their removal had literally saved the island from ecological death. And yet, the story doesn't end in tragedy. The island is bouncing back, faster than anyone believed possible. Insects, plants, birds, and natural cycles are returning. The web of life is reweaving itself before scientists' eyes. The Antipodes Islands have become a global symbol, not just of loss, but of resilience. Because now we know, if nature is given a fighting chance, even a dying world can be brought back from the edge. So, what do you think? Was the risk of wiping out every mouse on that island worth it? Let us know in the comments, and hit that like button if you're amazed by this story.